Thank you all for coming today. We're really delighted to see you here. Years ago, and this was eons ago, when I was in library school, there was a book called Choosing Books for Children, A Common Sense Guide by Betsy Hearn, which was kind of one of our touchstone books. And so when I heard that Betsy Hearn was, we were contacted by the College of Worcester and asked if we wanted Betsy to come today, I went, oh, Choosing Books for Children. That's right. And then over the years, I've read Betsy's work in many other places. In Hornbook and Booklist, she works with children's books and storytelling, and it was ubiquitous. I came across her work again and again in journals, in her own books. She's had a very illustrious career, teaching at the University of Illinois, the children's book editor of Booklist, which for those of you who aren't librarians is like one of the premier journals in library land. Editor of the Bulletin for the Center for Children's Books, another touchstone piece for us. She raised her own children. I like this one in your webpage, where she said they taught her as much as she taught them. And those of us who are parents can certainly understand that. Dr. Hearn spent her life cheering on, advocating for, and supporting children, children's books, and children's authors. And she started her career right here at WCPL, although not in this building, I would guess, right? Up the street from. So anyway, I want to thank the college for allowing us to have Dr. Hearn today, and for the Friends of the Library for sponsoring. We have a short reception here afterwards. And I want you to join me in welcoming Dr. Betsy Hearn.
I love being ubiquitous.
Yes.
That is a real tribute. It feels a little spread out, but I've got to hide for it. So, first of all, thanks for everyone who brought me here. The college, the library, and a couple of wonderful education classes where I spoke this morning to students who are actually studying what I've been studying all these years. Here's that book, Choosing Books for Children, 3rd edition. I think I'm going to first start out talking about storytelling by telling you the story of how I got here, which is that my history professor, who had counseled me faithfully, and history you're supposed to think about one thing happens and the next thing happens, and I could never think chronologically, but he stuck with me. And he said, after I graduated, I needed a job. As a history major, I couldn't get a job. So he said, there's something advertised for children's librarian down at the Worcester Library. You should go talk to them. So I talked to Miss Schwartz. I went in, and she said, well, what can you do? We need people who can tell stories to children. And I said, oh, I can tell stories. Which was a huge fat lie. I had no idea how to do that. I had lied in my day, which is a kind of story. So she hired me only on the condition that I would go, I believe, to Akron, because there was no children's program here, no library in the university. No courses, so I went there and I learned how to lie better. I learned more complicated stories, and I was really interested in folklore and folk tales, fairy tales, and this amazing world of children's literature that I'm going to sort of walk you through from the baby before it's even born all the way up. Well, we won't get all the way to 18 years old. The thing that struck me about storytelling, first with children, but then with adults, and then with elders, is the power of story. Without anything, without a screen, without a book. If there was a kid wiggling in the back row, I didn't have to say, stop wiggling or stop hitting your friend. I could just nail that person with my eyes, and they would be with me all of a sudden. Or I could shorten the story. so that it wasn't too long for them, because they were wiggly, they had too much energy. Or I could dramatize the story. Or I could actually bring them into the story. So what I found in the old library, there was an attic. And the first storytelling I had, there were only 3 people there, and 2 of them were siblings. At Halloween, we had 120 children there because of the storytelling. And we went up to this cold attic. It was the only thing that would hold them. And I decided to tell a Brer Rabbit story. And I started talking about Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. And Brer Fox was snarly and Brer Wolf was growling. And the children got closer and closer, and I noticed they were all snarling. And they had their tails going like this. And they got right up to my feet, and the little boy in the front threw up all over me. And I thought, this is power. This is too much power. I had to learn how to control this. He might have had the flu. But that year was pivotal for me to understand how important storytelling was for children. And then when I went to library school and also later got my PhD, I began to think bigger about story. I began to realize that we tell stories at work, we tell stories at church, we tell stories in the law firms, we tell stories in classes, in young classes, in older classes. Everybody's telling stories. And I tried to tell my university students that when I was teaching folklore and storytelling. And they said, we don't have any stories. And I said, yes, you do. And they said, we don't tell stories. I said, even in your family, at dinner time, you tell stories. I said, for instance, in my family, one time, I was running into the house, and my dog was barking, and I said, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy! And he was listening to the radio, and he was listening to the news of the war. And you never talked when my father was listening to the news of the war. He kept absolutely quiet. So I felt really bad being yelled at, and I went into the kitchen, and my mother was chopping vegetables. And she said, did I ever tell you about your great-grandmother? She was chopping vegetables, and she chopped open her hand. It was bleeding, it was chopped to the bone, and she grabbed a dish rag and stopped the bleeding. She was a midwife, and this was the 19th century. There were no doctors, and there were no nurses. But she stopped the bleeding, and she got a needle and thread and dipped it in boiling water, and she sewed up her left hand with her right hand. And she said, you know, there's all kinds of courage. And she knew that my father saw courage as being in the war, being injured, fighting on the front lines, dying. But she also wanted me to believe that you can do anything you have to as a woman, and that many women have been brave throughout history, and they don't get written up in the history books. And I was a history major, so I knew there were 2 women that were mentioned in my history major. One was Queen Elizabeth I, and the other one was Catherine the Great of Russia. Where were all those other women? They just got lost somewhere. So I began to think about that and to write the story that my mother told me and other stories that she told me. And what I realized was the stories that you hear tell you who you are. So that persuaded me that I could do anything if I persisted and was strong about it and brave about it, which I needed. Because when I was being educated, storytelling, and even in a PhD, storytelling was seen as kiddie stuff. And that was a real underestimation of the power of story. Now it's everywhere. We've got them off on the radio. We've got people who teach folklore everywhere. We hear about stories. everything in social media. There's a lot of storytelling going on. People are communicating, gossiping on social media. Those are all stories. You cannot kill stories. They are in the oral tradition, they're in the print tradition, and they're in the electronic tradition. So don't worry about story. It's not going to die. It's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to change shapes. In folklore, we call it a shape shifter. So I guess that's my reassurance that stories and books are not going to go away because we have social media, because we have online books, ebooks. It's just jumping from one different form to the other and shape-shifting, like Coyote, who turned into all these other creatures. I want to also talk about the importance of storytelling for learning language. When the baby is in the womb, the baby is listening. The baby can't see yet, but the baby is hearing. Like this is the first storytelling. It's heartbeat. And the heartbeat is establishing a rhythm the baby hears right from the beginning. The baby can't see, but the baby is hearing this up and down of the mother's voice, the rhythms of the mother's voice, the patterns of the mother's voice. And those are leading to language. Babies at the age of 4 months babble differently if they're Chinese, or if they're English speaking, or if they're speaking whatever language you can imagine. They are picking up the rhythm and the tonalities of language even before they're born, and certainly right after they're born and from then on. A baby will turn to the sound of the mother's voice first if there are a lot of people in the room. Even if the baby can't see yet or does not have clear vision early on, they will turn to that voice or another familiar voice that they've heard because they can hear through the womb. They can hear anger, they can hear shrieks, they can hear low tones, and those sounds are what lead them to learn how to speak. We talk to babies a long time before they learn how to talk to us. You're changing a baby, and you're saying, oh, this little piggy went to the market, this little piggy stayed home, you're playing with their toes, or you're saying, ooh, poopy, this is a stinky one. Or you're saying, whatever you're saying, the baby has no idea what you're saying. But you're being reassuring, you're touching, and as you keep continuing the words, the baby is practicing listening because you're paying attention. The most important thing about language development is interaction. And here's the problem with the screen. The screen is not listening. Before the age of 2, I really believe children should not be parked in front of screens, whether they're phones or whatever they are, computers. Because the baby's paying attention, the baby's looking, the baby's listening, but the screen is not responding. If I'm telling you stories, I can tell whether you're bored, or tired, or scared, or it's funny for you, or it's scary for you, and I can respond to that. I can reach out to you. If the screen is in front, the screen doesn't know whether you're sad or you're scared. There's a magic thing that happens between 3 elements: the storyteller, and the story listener. And those all interact to create this magical new creation. It's a kind of connection between the 3 that creates something new. If I talk to one group this morning, I'll talk differently to another group because it's a different interest, it's a different age, it's whatever it is, attention span. So that's my problem with screens at an early age. My answer to that is that you can interact with the screen and the child, because then you're serving to help as first responder. You and the child are responding together to a story, and you may be interpreting it, and you're certainly interpreting it to the child. If whatever comes on looks scary, you're turning it off, or you're talking to the child, talking through it. That starts as soon as you have that electronic interaction. You're with the child, you're talking them through it, you're responding with them, and that goes up, I have to say, all the way to where 18 or whatever. Of course, teenagers need privacy, but they also need to be able to talk about what's going on the internet, what's happening to them. Have they been threatened? Have they seen something obscene? Have they been approached by somebody scary? They won't tell you that if you have not already established the practice of talking with them about what they're looking at. And that really starts young. So it's the requirement of attention, being attentive, being interactive. So that's my sermon about stories, books, interaction. I think that it starts too, right after that baby is born, with all kinds of things that they won't understand yet. For instance, this is a book called Hush Little Baby. And if you can hold this book up and hold the baby without dropping either one of them, you can even be introducing them to board books at this early age by singing to them. For instance, if you're singing a lullaby, hush little baby, don't say a word, Mom's gonna buy you a mockingbird. If that mockingbird don't sing, Mom's gonna buy you a diamond ring. So you can hear the rhymes in that, you can hear the rhythms in it, they're hearing the repetition, they're learning, and song is magical. Even if you sound like a frog, they do not care what you sound like. I promise you. They will respond to that different kind of tonality and get involved with it. They're getting used to the turning of a book. They're getting used to the idea that there's an image there. And lots of our stories are visual now. So they're being introduced at this very young age. And of course, there's nursery rhymes that you can tell, or show books. Tom, Tom, the piper's son, stole a pig and away he run. The pig was eat and Tom was beat and Tom went crying down the street. That's crime and punishment. And all nursery rhymes did not cut corners about being kind or whatever. They had rough things going on. Hannah Bantry in the pantry, gnawing on her mutton bone, how she gnawed it, how she clawed it when she found herself alone. That's me with my little piece of chocolate over in the corner that I'm not supposed to be eating. Again, amazing, very book design in these nursery rhyme books that children can just look at and look at the pictures, and in their head will be lodged these nursery rhymes that we said. In fact, one of the students today said that she had the experience of hearing some rhymes and a rhyming story, and then much later someone read it to her, and she said she liked the first kind best because she was imagining and she was hearing it instead of just looking at the book, which she thought was quite boring. And those early nursery rhymes have wonderful new rhyme writers. And this is a rhyme writer you know, but Morty Sendak did Where the Wild Things Are. He did an early book that I love. What can you do? What can you do? What can you do with a shoe? You can put it on your ear, on your very eerie beard. You can wear it on your ear tralla, or wear it on your head, or butter it like bread, or use apple jam instead, ha-ha. So the idea that, and children will do that, they'll try all these different things out with an object. putting it on or spreading it out or banging on it or pouring their milk on it or whatever. So you see already these patterns that are emerging. And also, I want to talk about aesthetics, about character and plot and structure. It's important that stories teach a beginning and a middle and an end. Because you know how some people don't know how to stop talking? Well, the fact is that children learn stories and they first tell them in heaps. This and that and the other and that and this and that and just heaps of things. You ask them what a movie is about and they never stop and you have no idea what the movie was about. But they begin to say, this happened, therefore this happened, and this happened, and there is a sense of, all right, there's a transition here, and there's a cause-effect, and there is repetition, and then there's a closure. And we all need to know how to close our stories. So that's something that lots of grown-ups don't know yet. So this is about a sister and a brother, and it's called Max's Breakfast. Eat your egg, Max, said Max's sister Ruby. Bad egg, said Max. No, strawberries until your egg goes down, Max, said Ruby. So Max hid his egg under the napkin. But Ruby found it. Max hid his egg again. Ruby found it. Open up, Max, said Ruby. But this time, Max hid himself underneath the table. Bad egg, said Max. Good egg, says Ruby. And she shows Max how to eat the egg. Oh, all gone, said Max. And that's the trickster story at a very, very young age. Basically, the little guy, and you can see this all the way up through Jack and the Beanstalk and into our modern novels, the little guy wins over the big guy by tricking. And you see that all over in folklore. And you have all of this in dialogue, and it's quick events, it's great illustration so that the kids can see what's happening on a cartoon. I'm a big advocate of cartoons. I didn't love them as a professional or a big shot giving lectures, and then I realized through my grandchildren how important cartoons were. Because when I was growing up, we weren't really encouraged to look at cartoons, but we snuck them. And I never want to admit in my professional life that I snuck things. So eventually I realized that those things you sneak are pretty important. So I'll have to speed up here because I have to. Sometime.
Yeah, we're here.
So I'll give you one more. The shortest story in children's literature is called George and Martha. It might be the shortest story in all of literature, but I'll have to describe it for you a bit. The first line is, George was fond of peeking into windows. And George the hippopotamus is shown here peeking through a window. What's going to happen next? One day, George peeked in on Martha. And this time, his friend Martha is taking a bath. And that's the window. What's going to happen next? He never did that again. We are friends, said Martha, but there is such a thing as privacy. And now we see George with the tub upside down on his head, where Martha has upended it. There is a period where the babies are completely, toddlers don't care what you see of them, and then they begin to grow up, and suddenly they have a sense of privacy. Suddenly, as it's sometimes 3 years old, 2.5 years old. They want their own little private space. So I can't go into each of these, but I'll just touch base about as you move away from picture book reading to reading easy-to-read books. Skills and drills are not the way to teach reading. Reading should be play. Play as in narrative that has some strength of what's happening next or who's happening next. And it's true that you have to do some skills and drills. You have to learn to read, which can be a very difficult process. But the payoff needs to be stories, whether they're nonfiction or fiction, whatever the child is interested in. And most of the children I know are interested in those stories. So you have this very short, easy-to-read ghost story. In a dark, dark wood, there was a dark, dark house. In the dark, dark house, there was a dark, dark room. In the dark, dark room, there was a dark, dark chest. And in the dark, dark chest, there was a ghost. Most kids just jump out of their skin. Even though they know that story, they tell it to each other. But there's something, it's coming out of a respectable book that they know how to read. There are very few words in there. And this is an example, I won't go through it, but these two little boys meet each other. They both have the same balloon. It's called Mine is Best. And they meet each other, and each one of them said, mine's the best. No, mine's the best. There are only 25 words in the whole book. So they basically have a fight, and they punch each other's balloons. And slowly the balloons are deflating. And meanwhile, you see people walking by with the same balloon, but these two are just bent on their argument. And finally, one says, yours is sick because the balloons are deflating. And the other one says, no, yours is sick. And the first one says, yours is dead. And there's the flattened balloon. And the other one says, yours is dead too. And then they finally notice another person carrying the same balloon. And they hook their arms in each other and say, ours was best. So, they found a common enemy. And I have to tell you, she's a girl and you're boys. But what can you do? So I won't talk too much about cumulative stories, but when you add something on, like Old MacDonald has a farm, and then you add the pig, and you add the cow, and you add this, that, and the other, and that kind of repetition is really important for that sense of structure, as well as vocabulary, as well as attention span. So I'll leap into my favorite folk tales. This is an Aesop's Fable story about a lion and a mouse. It's, as you can see, doesn't have a title, doesn't have any words on the cover. And the reason for that is because the lion is in your face. This is a lion that's so powerful, it takes over the whole front cover. And on the back is the mouse. But interestingly, the mouse, which is so much smaller than the lion, actually, it turns out in the story has as much power because the lion catches the mouse but then lets it go, and then the lion is trapped and the mouse comes and gnaws away the ropes on the lion. And so they're equal in power. And that's a message to children, not only about compassion, but also about the power of small things standing up to large things. It's all in the illustrations. He had the brilliant idea of only using animal sounds, so a child can read that very complicated story without reading any words. And so it's very safe for them if they're afraid of reading or they've had difficulties. This is another one of my favorites, Seven Blind Mice. And you can see what's been done here. Instead of white pages, with dark images. The images are black because the mice are blind. They can't see what they're doing. And their little white eyes show up against the dark. And they're each trying to understand and feel their way as to what this is. And because each one is only feeling a little part of this creature, they make wrong guesses. Like one only feels the trunk, one only feels the tail, one only feels the tusk. And finally, the last one goes all over the creature and says, "This is an elephant," realizing the perspective of it. And that is a great lesson on point of view. Like, we're arguing over the same thing. This person has one idea, this person has the other idea, and together we form a larger idea if we're working together and put it all together, which we could use in our political situation today. If everybody could learn how to listen to each other. The child wrote her name in the book. The child took the book to bed. Actually chewed on both ends. That's the great thing about board books, is they're edible. Screens are not edible, and you cannot drool on them, you cannot throw up on them. It's really important that they have the book to smell, to taste. So this is an old Three Billy Goats Gruff, and it was something that I used to hear in the playground. I was in a park and I heard a child run under the slide, and there was another child on top of the slide, and the one underneath said, "Who's that tramping under my bridge?" On my bridge. I thought that's a child that's been read to. I just will flash these by you. I was the chair of the Caldecott Committee in 2005, and this is the winter, Kitten's first full moon. This was an honor book, Coming on Home Soon. And I thought this was a remarkable group of pictures. These are clearly for younger kids. It's Kitten thinks that the moon is a big full bowl of milk. And so she keeps jumping up and trying to get it. And of course falls in the water. And it's a very simple first experience. Well, this is much more complicated, and yet it's very short. This is about a young African-American girl whose mother has to go north. You can see this is really a quiet story. Her mother has to go north to get a job. And she's left with her grandmother. And the kind of sadness that comes to her, that she writes to her mother and she wants her to come home. And finally, in the end, her mother is able to come home. And I think that the power of that story is that it does have a happy ending, but it also has the strength of feeling a loss, which many children do, and separation. I would say one word about gender. And that is that for a long time, boys were seen as active and girls were seen as more passive. They didn't have the big adventure roles. That's all changed now with fantasy and the women's movement. But an example of my being able to equalize that in a classroom, for instance, would be to take two Caldecott Award books, The Man Who Walked Between Two Towers, and this is true. This man was a daredevil, and he managed to get a string of cable between the two towers, which are no more in New York. And he walked the towers above the city of New York. Let's see if I can find the spread. This is a spread that opens up in the book. And here he is walking above New York City, between the towers. And he lies down, takes a rest, and then is arrested when he finishes his walk across. And so it's such an interesting question. Why did he do it? Why would anybody do that? And that leads to a discussion about why do you take risks? When do you take risks? What kind of risks do you take? That's that kind of interaction over a book that's important. And then I would introduce Mirette on the High Wire, is about also a true story about a young girl who gets enamored of walking on a tightrope. And this is something that I almost can't do anymore. But every one of us has tried to walk along the top of a wall, and she gets enthralled with that, and she trains and eventually becomes a performer on the High Wire. And it's important that I show those books, that girls too take risks, and whether they're safe or not, have something to discuss. All this is based on 40 years that I saw all the children's books that were published every year. So I was a book review editor, and they all came in and I reviewed those books and had many wonderful meetings with librarians in choosing the books that we thought were best. My favorite ever book is Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. I had a chance I knew her and I interviewed her for this 50th edition. And the books I've written are in three age groups. The first is The Seven Brave Women, and that's part of the story that I told you. They're each of brave women in the family. And the next one is Wishes, Kisses, and Pigs, about a girl who wishes her brother was a pig, and he turns into one, and then she has to undo it. I thought my brothers were pigs, and I was never able to actually turn them into pigs, but we made up in the end. Let's see, I've written The Canine Connection because I adore dogs, and it started out with the story of a puppy that we got in Ireland, a little sheepdog. And we got it because our daughter found this puppy in a box of puppies that a sheep herder was selling very cheap because it was pouring rain. And Elizabeth brought she brought us out to this very damp world, pouring rain, and there was these damp little puppies, and she said to me, "You're always working, and you say that you're too busy to have a dog, but now you're on vacation, and these dogs are the most intelligent dogs in the world, and we have to have this one." So this dog lived to be 17 years old, and she herded everything. She herded gulls, she herded squirrels. Squirrels belonged in trees, gulls belonged in the air. She rounded them up, she got them up there, and she herded tennis balls. And my husband used to throw a tennis ball up past her. She would jump, twist, catch it with her side teeth over her shoulder, bring it back to him, full tilt, drop it in front of him, wait for it again. She never wanted to stop. Border Collies can run 100 miles herding sheep. They're so smart, and they listen to these commands. So that was one of the stories that actually was another book, but I got enamored with dogs. And early on, my favorite story in the world was East of the Sun and West of the Moon, because it had a brave woman, and she saved the prince, and she saved her family. And I read it over and over because my mother was a brave woman, and I was going to be a brave woman. And it turns out that I got really interested in Beauty and the Beast, and did my dissertation and wrote some books on it. And I realized, finally, after a long time, that Beauty and the Beast is a version of East of the Sun and West of the Moon. So I was still hearing my childhood self when I got involved in this as a scholar. And probably the only one who still loved my topic in the graduating blind. And the last thing I'll show you is a book called Narrative Compass. And you can tell from what I've talked about that I believe everybody has a story. Everybody has a story that shaped them, that they remember. It's made them who they are. It could be a folk tale, it could be a family story, it could be a work story, it could be a warning story, it could be a confidence story. It's something that stays with you. And when I was talking about this, one of my colleagues came up and she said, I'm talking about Beauty and the Beast being mine, and she said, my story is Little Women. And she said, I was one of those girls, and this is who I was, and it stayed with me all my life. And I said, well, let's invite some other people to tell their stories. And we invited this group of scholars to tell us their stories. They were amazing. In the diversity, there were two African Americans who talked about becoming a scholar. One had grown up in Detroit, and parents never allowed her to go out because the neighborhood was too rough. And another one was one who fell in love with Anne of Green Gables. Of all things, it was so alien to where she was living, where she grew up. Not to mention the racial issue. Nothing stopped her. She grew up, and with that story, became an English scholar, now a professor. A Native American talked about the stories in her tribe, and they were very rhythmic stories. They were poetry. She became a poet, and she became a professor teaching in that language to people who were losing the language. So we had an amazing variety of these stories. And I just challenge you to think about that. Everybody has stories. And in fact, when I talk about 7 Brave Women, often people will come up to me and say, you know, my grandmother had a story like that. I remember one of them. She said she was so tiny and there was no medical help, and they actually put her in the oven to keep her warm. Whoa, that's really something. I mean, you know what I thought? Hansel and Gretel. I'm not sure I like that story, but it was a wonderful story, and it was a story about saving lives. So we probably don't have time for questions. Do we? Do we have questions? I talked at you, now talk at me. There are 2 people in this room that have heard me presenting all day. And one is Joan Fury, and one is Allison Schmidt. And I just want to thank you for your patience. They are listeners.
Betsy, who are you reading or excited about now in children's literature? Is there somebody interesting?
You know, I don't keep up with it the way I used to. I really keep up with folklore. Mm-hmm. I feel like for 40 years I saw about 5,000 books a year. Wow. And, you know, I OD'd. I mean, I felt like I needed to step back. And I did give myself a break when I studied Beauty and the Beast because I went back centuries to that story as it emerged from folklore into book form and into film form. And so I was able to look back through the book ages. But mostly I was looking at new books very quickly and writing about them and then moving on to the next book. And I was able to stop doing that when I retired 10 years ago. And I found myself going back in time to the folk tales. And I still remember the folk tales. I tell them probably on my deathbed. I will be telling folk tales, or somebody will be telling me family stories, or whatever. That's what I go back to. However, through my grandchildren, I get so excited about their gaming, They do amazing, imaginative games, both online and on the floor. When I have an autistic grandson, and his room is covered with Legos. And every single Lego creation represents a huge fantasy world. He can tell you the story, and he doesn't want anybody to touch it because he's the one that controls the fantasy world. Yes, same with you. Bingo. And do you play both online and like? See, that's such a, you're learning how to build things. That is so exciting. And then I used to not like rap. And then one of my daughters sent me a video of two of the kids, one 18 and one 12. And they had to put the dishes away, which they hate, after cleaning the dishwasher. And one of them had put on rap, and they were rapping. It was like a fork, and a spoon, and a knife, and a plate. Watch the plate, the cup, and it was fabulous. They were dancing. That was about body and story and music. We are right back to that. We are right back to that household language. It's about embodiment of stories. And rap does that. And maybe it's too loud for you, or maybe it's too lewd for you, but there's something happening there that's connecting with a new generation that has to deal with things that we never had to deal with. So I'm learning in my old age not to be as judgmental. And I think that every time our youngest the grandchild is 1, and the next one is 3, and the 3-year-old now reads to the 1-year-old because the 3-year-old had messed up when she was a baby, and I see that progressing up through the 12-year-old, who, although he has a lot of difficulties, the autistic one, with relationships with his peers, he will read anything, everything he gets his hands on, those complicated fantasies. So I'm pretty convinced that this is the way, the truth, and the life. Long answer to a short question. You had enough? It's getting late. It's almost dinner time. Thank you so much for listening. You are a great audience.
Join us. We've got a short version. Reception back here.